Good evening. My name is Uta Poiga, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern. It's such a pleasure to welcome you this evening to our important discussion, Racial Literacy Culture. Before we get started, I want to just do a few items of housekeeping. I would urge each of you to open the chat. In the chat, you can find additional information on how to update your Zoom. That is particularly important if you seek to have the interpreters and the speakers on your screen at the same time. I also want to alert you to the fact that the chat will be open for comments and ultimately for questions after our presentations. And so again, the chat function is something that you can make use of during our webinar conversation on racial literacy culture this evening. Today's event, subsequent events, and the associated pop-up course are sponsored by Northeastern's Presidential Council on Diversity and Inclusion that the Dean of the Law School, James Hackney, and I are co-chairing. And these events, as well as the associated pop-up, build on a tradition of collaboration between student affairs and the academic side of Northeastern, a collaboration that has always been very important and continues to be so very important in these times. I want to thank all of the colleagues on today's panel for getting university-wide conversations underway, for fostering university-wide conversations on this important topic of racial literacy, on the ways in which we can move forward in a world where racism remains an important force that we need to combat. I'm also particularly grateful to our colleagues today for talking with us about how to think about culture in that context. Culture is central, no doubt, to racial literacy, to historical and contemporary understandings of race and racism. Together, our panelists, with you, the audience, will explore how culture, including, for example, art and fiction, shapes notions of race and racial hierarchies, and also creates so many possibilities for change. To get us started in this important dialogue, I would like to introduce our moderator today, Dr. Nicole Aljoe. Dr. Aljoe is the director of the Africana Studies program at Northeastern, and she is an associate professor of English and Africana Studies. She has published widely in a number of fields, including 18th and 19th century Black literature, the slave narrative, post-colonial studies, and also the British novel. She is also one of Northeastern's pioneers in the field of digital humanities and the ways in which the digital humanities can help us reach broader publics, be that locally in Boston, be that in the Caribbean, or be that across the Atlantic and the world. It's a great pleasure to turn the microphone over to you, Dr. Aljoe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Poiger, for that lovely introduction. I want to begin by acknowledging that Northeastern stands on the original homelands of the Wampanoag people and at the crossroads of Roxbury, the South End, and Mission Hill, majority Black and Brown communities centered around the recently reclaimed Nubian Square. I am excited to start us off on this third event offered in this important racial literacy series. I'd like to also thank Professors Robinson Wood and Cushman for inviting me to organize and moderate this panel focused on the relationship between racial literacies and notions of culture. I'd like to also thank the participants in the last panel for setting us up so nicely. That last panel, which focused primarily on the relationship between history and racial literacies, spent a great deal of time discussing the history of public art in Boston and Northeastern's complicated relationship with AMARP, the African American Master Artist Residency Program. I am joined this evening by four colleagues, Drs. Pearson and Kim from the English Department in the College of Social Sciences and Humanities, and Dr. Sutton from Art and Design in CAMD, to consider some of the ways in which culture is central to racial literacy. We will also explore how culture, as Dean Poiger explained, including art and fiction, shapes notions of race and racial hierarchies, and also creates these possibilities for change. After briefly introducing themselves, the panelists will offer initial comments about our topic for this evening. Broadly speaking, the comments you'll hear tonight will engage with two primary aspects of culture. In the first instance, we'll be talking about culture in reference to the arts as an object of study, right? This is considering art, fiction, painting, museums, that kind of thing. And then secondly, we'll also engage with culture as a process connected to identity, society, and particular kinds of experiences. The importance of culture to issues of social and racial issues is reflected in the understanding that new laws and policies focused on equity cannot be effective if cultural narratives replicate unthoughtful, racist, or elitist ideas. Take, for example, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, which affirmed the legal enfranchisement of African Americans. But in the absence of similar substantive changes to cultural narratives about African Americans, we also saw the proliferation of movies like Planet of the Apes, which represent Black power as oppressive to whites, monstrous, and ultimately savage. Despite the important work of a small but resilient number of Black filmmakers and producers, the vast majority of big screen representations of Black people in the immediate post-civil rights era continue to trade in racist ideologies and tropes. This reveals the fact that it is not enough to create diversity. Just adding more people will not change the system. We must completely change the rules and perspectives in order to create a truly effective social equity. Sorry. This is harder and involves rethinking those cultural narratives and ways of thinking about cultural objects that contribute to what scholar Edward Said has called the consolidated vision of empire. And he used this in reference to the ways in which 18th and 19th century British fiction often supported the project of empire. As an example, the beautiful houses in Austen's novels are often dependent upon money and materials that frequently come from the labor of enslaved people. Now, this is not to say, and his argument is not, that Austen is a raging imperialist writing propaganda for the state, but rather that we cannot consider the gorgeous house without also considering the horror that created and sustained that house. Austen herself wants us to see the complexity of the 18th century world, and she tells us this explicitly in Mansfield Park and other novels. Considering this more inclusive and accurate perspective of 18th century history and its works highlights that there's a fantasy highlights the fantasy that is frequently a feature of simplistic costume dramas of Austen's works. My own scholarship is focused on contributing to these more inclusive understandings of the 18th century. Specifically, I draw upon post-colonial and Black feminist theories to understand and analyze the writing by and about Blacks in the 18th and 19th century. This does not mean that I anachronistically expect 18th century people to act like 21st century people and have 21st century concerns, but rather, given what we know now about relationships between issues such as power and race, or just put simply, considering the 18th century from the perspective of someone other than a straight white male, the century and its works looks very different. And of course, this perspective is grounded in my own experience as a Black woman. And it's also grounded in the sheer and abiding annoyance that most people underestimate the diversity and dynamism of Black culture, but especially early Black culture. This also relates to the second aspect of culture that we'll be discussing this evening, culture as a particular narrative or associations around identity. It also relates to the story I told during the kickoff panel, where I shared that well-meaning ninth grade teacher introduced us to Their Eyes Are Watching God by explaining that this was going to be a story about the Black experience, which overlooked the fact, right, that I, as a student in the class, was coming from an Afro-Caribbean experience. Although my teacher thought he was being inclusive by having us read Their Eyes Are Watching God, because his ideas about Black culture were grounded in stereotype, his efforts at diversifying our reading curriculum failed. And as I discovered later, when I was able to return to the novel in graduate school, he had ultimately misread Hurston's novel, which was actually about universal human themes, such as identity and how we are perceived by others, and whether we choose to submit or challenge those views. And that Horston had grounded these ideas, these universal ideas, within a very specific Black community in Florida. I know that it was hard for my parents, who had been educators in Jamaica, to teach me about the fallibility of teachers. But as a mother now myself, I know that they felt it was necessary to provide me with the tools to succeed, as well as to develop racial resilience grounded in reserves of my own self-awareness. This awareness developed out of an understanding of my own cultural narrative that knew about the diversity of Black experience. My colleague, Dr. Pearson, whose scholarship focuses on theories of racial literacies and writing pedagogies, will be taking the floor next. Dr. Pearson?
Yeah, so I've been teaching about how to get to the core of the story, right? How cultural narratives helps us to understand like how we understand individuality, right? Our socialization, how we become to know who we are in a particular context. I teach it with my students, and then I decided to teach my own, to share my own. And I am ready to share my own narrative in this context. So it was a hot spring day in May 1973 when I learned a hard lesson about color and the real difference between me and my best friend Jody. We were third graders, Girl Scouts, sisters of infant little brothers, and children of military dads. Jody and I spent a lot of time together. She was the first person outside of my cousins that had a sleepover. Our dads were friends, or at least close co-workers in the Army. I liked Jody because out of all the kids in my class, she and I seemed to be and have the most in common, at least on the surface. Jody was pinkish with long, wavy red hair, freckled all over. She was kind of quiet, like in class, like most of us girls, but at recess and Girl Scouts, she was kind of bossy. Over time, I noticed a few more differences between Jody and me. For example, she loved to go swimming. I didn't. Swimming was always a challenge with my hair. The aftermath of swimming meant washing and redoing my hair, a long process that was brutal and it exasperated my mom. So I mostly avoided it purposely, getting my hair wet. But it was on field day that our real differences would become illuminated to me in a most painful and humiliating way. Field day consisted of outside games, outside lunch, outside everything. In South Carolina in May, outside was hot. But at 8 years old, I wasn't concerned with hydration or sunburn. I was just excited to run around outside with Jody playing in the sun. At one point, Jody says, "Let's lay out and get a tan." And so I did. We laid in the grassy knoll next to the concrete playground. I laid out under the direct afternoon sun, basting my little brown body to a richer hue of chocolate next to Jody's pinkish one, turning into a deeper hue of fuchsia. Later that night, I had a raging headache. My body burned all over and I was dry heaving and sobbing. My mom knew that I was reacting from sun overexposure. She snapped at me the peculiar way that she demonstrates concern. "Why were you in the sun so much today?" Black mothers have no time for foolishness when it comes to matters of health or public humiliation. Their fear and anger and sickness or situation is often misdirected toward the victim rather than the insidious assailant. It was just this Southern way. My mom was one of 11 children who would all obtained some higher education in the rural South from the 1920s to the 70s with only their work ethic and faith. We are a mixture of Irish, Native American, and African, light to dark, an ancestral fragmentation imposed by the institution of slavery. One cruel vestige of enslavement is how it disrupts normal constructs of familial care and connection. Enslaved people could not maintain normal family structures because at the time, mothers, fathers, and children could be separated and sold away. To maintain their safety of their children, parents in rural South learned to tough love their children. To love children into a false sense of security, overprotection, and inflated self-esteem could lead to their harm and devastation. So there was little sympathy shown towards getting into intentional messes, which could lead to their sickness or trouble. This is conventional and generational wisdom. We children learn to interpret loving scorn as the way they knew how to love. So my mom showed very little compassion for my sunstruck condition. Instead, she chided, "Don't you know better than to lay out in the sun? You ain't white. Aren't you black enough? You black enough." Shattered my 8-year-old consciousness. My blackness was too much. It was too much and bad. Later, I learned that my mom's disdain for color or for darkness was called colorism. Another vestige of enslavement when lighter skinned and darker skinned Black people were stratified along the color line. It was also a part of my epiphany that my Blackness was not regarded in the same regard as Jodi's whiteness. Her sunburns earned her empathy and a sick day. Mine would be a lasting point of teasing and ridicule with each family reunion. Until this day, I have a cousin who reminds me of the time that I thought I was a white girl and laid out in the sun. I internalized the oppression of color discrimination so much, like many young Black women, I attempted to overcompensate with resistance to most things considered or associated with Blackness. I tried to be as non-Black on the inside as I could be. This is really hard to face now, but as a teenager, I rejected popular culture of urban Black kids. I didn't use slang. I didn't dress hip. I made it a point to recognize rock, punk, alternative music. I was terrified of being called out in school. I made friends with white kids very easily because often I prioritized their worldviews over my own. What's worse about this is, as I think about it, I was, in a sense, actually regarded by white people for it. To them, I was regarded as good, articulate, etc. But to many of my Black peers, I was trying to act white. I was called Oreo more times than I can accurately recall. I remember giving a guy a ride to school and my radio was fixed onto the soft rock station. I was bopping along to the next, My Sharona. And he looked at me. "So you're like a white Black girl, huh?" Growing up in the 70s and 80s, TV made the greatest impact on my color consumption. Each program would reinforce reasons for me to withdraw and questions my skin color, surroundings, differences, and value. Rarely did the programs reinforce solidarity or pride with my connection to my culture or my racial identity. In the all too few TV programs depicting Black people, they always seem to be poor but happy, scratching and surviving in the ghetto. My favorite TV program, Saturday morning program, was Bill Cosby and the Cosby Kids. Fat Albert in the game demonstrated incredible ingenuity and talent in a junkyard in the South Philly ghetto. They taught me lessons of morality and confidence and pride. Fat Albert and the guys were the closest resemblance to how my cousins and I would play outside my grandfather's farm. They fashioned musical instruments, go-karts, board games, almost anything from discarded trash in a junkyard. My show was often interrupted by commercials, breaks with white children who possessed brand name, shiny instruments, and toys. But the worst ads were the ones with blonde-haired, blue-eyed, happy, lifelike dolls, often loved by their human lookalikes. My mom bought me one of those once. I mutilated her. In every show, there was one stark contrast after another. White people on TV were either superheroes or rich families who lived in big houses, almost every good and wholesome thing you could imagine. What really resonated with me was that the white families were loving, kind, and patient with their children. In every episode of Little House on the Prairie, The Brady Bunch, or The Waltons, moms and dads were affectionate, and the moral lessons were gentle and encouraging. All the moms and all the dads were courageous and wise. All the cops were noble. By the early 80s, The Cosby Show emerged depicting wholesome Black family. But after so many years, the opposite of us believed to show it was implausible. That internalized oppression again. Because Blackness was rendered so problematic in so many constructs, I resolved for so many years to reject it, just be myself, outside the dominant narrative. It was a lonely place. I never felt like I truly fit in anywhere. I was miserable in college, and so I dropped out. After serving 5 years in the military, I returned to focus, and I majored in English and African American studies. And that's where I became acquainted with Black feminists. I felt born again. I absorbed Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker, the most beautiful storytellers about girls and women being unapologetically Black, courageous and smart. And then I met Toni Morrison. She made me confront the underpinnings of racism in the ways that Black families uniquely resisted conventions of whiteness to remain their authentic selves, good, bad, and different. It was through Toni Morrison's Blue Aside that I met Pecola Breedlove, a young girl driven to madness because of her obsession with blue eyes, and the idea that if she had them, she would be loved. She and I were kindred. Black feminists literally saved my life. And it was because of that it saved my love for my mother, because I understand now, even if she never will, how deeply rooted internalized oppression can be and how I act within that oppression, mostly unconsciously. Ultimately, Black feminism helped me rise above my fragmented heritage and ancestry to understand that there are no single stories and there are multiple ways to interpret familial love. And it taught me to love myself, even if the world wasn't going to. I hand this over to my colleague, Gloria, to explain more about culture and narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pearson, for that. My introductory remarks, I've sort of coupled or titled as Marginality as Subject and Methodology Within Art History. So starting in 2016, one of the constant refrains among my contemporary art historian colleagues was the need to alter our teaching methods to counter the ways that the election manifest more latent forms of racism and misogyny. My response then, as it is now, was the fact that my own lived experience continues to serve as my radical pedagogy. If 2016 marked an uptick in feminist consciousness raising among my peers, it also confirmed for me that very little had changed in my field. As the only tenured person of color in my art and design department here at Northeastern, my presence is always the exception. And as a woman from a working class mixed race background, I remain one of the only contemporary art historians in the entire field tenured at a private university who received her PhD from a public one. My identity as an American was the first privileged position I occupied, a status that was made paramount every day, having to show my military ID at the various army bases from El Paso, Texas to Schwäbisch Gmünd, Germany, where my white father was stationed with my South Korean immigrant mother in the early 1980s. My father's rank as an enlisted soldier rather than an officer meant that while I went to school with kids whose parents went to college, we lived in separate housing complexes, were seen at different health clinics, and used different recreational facilities. Those were just the overt markers of class distinction. Growing up as a military brat not only prepared me for the peripatetic life of an academic, but it also made visible the invisible codifications that reinforce class, gender, and racial divisions. Now, through this panel, reflecting back, I can draw direct connections between how both the military and academia rely on an invisible control structure that implicitly shapes how one lives, works, and learns, which turns on what author Resmaa Menakem calls, quote, white body supremacy. Now, Jennifer is going to drop a link to this reference in the chat for you to pick up. So this idea of white body supremacy is a way to think about the racialization of everyday experience. The other public resource that shaped my work on cultural literacy were the many art museums that offered open talks, free tours, access to collections, and library privileges that afforded me an international world-class art historical education, not because my family was a member, but simply because I was a citizen. And importantly, my status as a resident could be confirmed. The need to carry validation was imprinted on me at a very early age, since my countenance and coloring remained ambiguous as well as contextual. In Europe, for example, I read as Asian, as it did not, and frequently still does not, compute that I could be both American and Asian at the same time when I go to deliver lectures or participate on international panels. During my undergraduate experience in North Carolina and my graduate school time in the state of California, my ambiguous looks and lack of discernible accent meant for many of my peers and professors that I did not count as minority, and my work in museums somehow signaled that I passed as middle class. These experiences made me highly attuned to the contextual background against which race figures, setting up my long-term investment in understanding the political stakes of cultural representation and how the understanding of identity is a mediated one. So, as a scholar who specializes in two emergent and thus marginal fields, contemporary art and media art, I'm often asked about the relevance of historical methodologies to subjects that are inherently tethered to the new and the now. My response is that contemporary art historians, we don't occupy a position of remove. We are absolutely complicit with the curators, the editors, critics, archivists, conservation experts, gallerists, and especially the artists themselves, who generate the primary source material and the interpretive network that coalesce into the historical record. The political and ethical stakes that motivate my participation in an art world, which by definition traffics in exclusivity and restricted access, is a conversation I'm very well prepared to engage. But more disconcerting is how often my own positionality becomes assumed or circumscribed by the fixity of what art historian and my colleague Huey Copeland has precisely termed as, quote, identitarian formations. Jen is going to also post to the chat a reference to Copeland's book, Bound to Appear, Art, Slavery, and the Sight of Blackness in Multicultural America, for your reference too. This refers to the fact that colleagues ask me to teach topics on Asian art history, often not because it is my specialty, but simply because my own Korean American identity, which is often followed up with the rationale that, quote, we are getting so many of those students and they would like a class about their art, echoing nativist anti-immigrant rhetoric. Likewise, rather than seeing the work of artists of Asian descent bearing on, let alone influencing contemporary art writ large, it is often suggested by colleagues at peer-reviewed journals to publish texts on these artists in specialist volumes geared toward geographic specificities. These experiences have helped me see my renewed stakes for my current book project on the Japanese-born New York-based artist Shigeko Kubota, which in turn mirrors the artist's own delayed reception in North America. Specifically, Kubota noted that it was fitting that her first mid-career retrospective would be at an institution devoted to marginality in the art world. That is a museum devoted to media art and located in Queens, for according to Kubota, who she called, what she said, the place of immigrants, suggesting that even if the square footage and lighting existed in Manhattan to accommodate her large-scale video sculptural works, she, quote, couldn't have a show anyway. The Whitney is only for Americans and MoMA is too slick. And also, I'd have to die to show there, is what Kubota said. And her assessment bore itself out. It is only after her passing will the artist be granted a solo exhibition, which will open at the Museum of Modern Art in 2022, which is an exhibition I'm currently working on. Ultimately, I would say, my stakes as an art historian are to demonstrate the ways that lived experiences of race, gender, class, and ability not only regulate and legislate bodies, but also point out the ways that they shape the reception of artists like Kubota within the discourse that define what becomes history. Rather than continually inscribing concentric circles around qualifiers of visual art and culture, such as feminist, Asian, or video, I'm invested in making visible the ways that contemporary art history is subjected to cycles of conformism and acts of erasure. When we claim our own stakes, then simply following the field's often narrow, predetermined ones, I would say we can really critically recuperate marginality, not only as a subject, but I would say a compelling methodology for art history. So thank you. And I'm going to pass now to Dr. Eunsong Kim.
Thank you, Dr. Sutton. And thank you so much, Dr. Pearson, for sharing your journey with us, and then also Dr. Aljoe for bringing us all together. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. My name is Dr. Eunsong Kim, and so as a professor of literature, that's what I teach here in the English department, perhaps it would not surprise you if I told you that I grew up learning and loving to read. It's almost a cliche at this point, I think, the English professor who loves to read. But I read, and this is no hyperbole, everything. I began reading young adult books, and I will date myself here and say something like Sweet Valley High, Babysitter's Club, which is now making some kind of retro comeback. And then I moved to British classics, everything from The Secret Garden, Jane Austen, and also the Bronte sisters. And sometime in high school, I ended up in Eastern Europe, devouring everything by Milan Kundera. To say I loved and love text is a matter of fact. Perhaps some of you noticed that I referenced a predominantly white canon located in the US and then in all regions of Europe. My early reading adventures began in local libraries through the recommendations of my teachers. They assigned and directed me to a canon they knew well, and I understand why they did this. And simultaneously, when I first read Stewart Hall, the cultural theorist, who stated, and I believe that there's a PowerPoint slide with this quote so that you can read it as well. And so this is Stewart Hall saying, quote, "I am not a liberal Englishman like you. In the back of my head are things that can't be in the back of your head. That part of me comes from a plantation when you owned me. I was brought up to understand you. I read your literature. I knew daffodils off by heart before I knew the name of a Jamaican flower. You don't lose that. It becomes stronger, end quote. As an Asian American reader, I felt this and still feel this sentiment as a breath of fresh air. Stewart Hall was a theorist educated in Jamaica and later in England, and ultimately taught in British universities, writing extensively on the analysis of culture. He argued that culture was not a passive site of consumption, like many of the panelists spoke about today, but an active site of power where we negotiate power. And he wrote on everything from poetry to television to make this point. I want to spend the short time I have going through Hall's quote as it relates to how we can understand the dynamics of race and power today. First, the line, I am not a liberal Englishman like you. So I too am not a liberal Englishman, not an Englishman, but like many others was educated like one. The distinction Hall makes that he is not a, quote, liberal Englishman marks who the anonymous reader and student is often supposed to be, from who he is. Standard education in the humanities was and is a practice of building good liberal citizens. However, some of us can never be these good citizens because we have been legally barred because we are subjects from the colony, former and after, and beyond. This distinction and difference is important to mark. It's important to say out loud that culture and the education of culture was not and continues to not be built with many of us in mind. Then, in the back of my head are things that can't be in the back of your head. So I can't remember the first time I realized I had to read and watch and think beyond what I was assigned. I can tell you that for many years, I spent pointing out to my teachers, professors, then colleagues that the cast of the film was almost all white and how the artwork perpetuated white supremacy and the syllabi US and Eurocentric. And then I began writing about this as a graduate student. So in 2014, for an example, I co-wrote an essay critiquing the operations of white supremacy in prominent museum shows, focusing particularly on the Whitney Biennial that year. The curators of the biennial selected a white artist's Black persona project, what some artists called and described as conceptual blackface, in lieu of actual and living Black artists. While critiquing artwork and literature that perpetuates the forms of oppression made permissible by white supremacy, it becomes clear that some of us are having two different conversations. Too many work to deny the operations of race and cultural production by stating that race is not real, so why do we have to talk about it? Why is it being brought up? And yes, race is not real, but made real by laws and cultural production, such as art, as Dr. Sutton described. And so if we want to move beyond it, we have to work together to unmake race in all the forms of power in which the structural forces of white supremacy continue to dominate. Art and literature is intimately implicated in the process that continues to make race real. The line, the part of me that comes from a plantation when you owned me. I'm grateful for this line as it reminds me as an Asian American woman to clarify the difference between myself and members of the Black diaspora. When trying to publish one of the first anthologies of Asian American writing, titled IE, one of its main editors, Sean Wong, told me that all of the presses turned down the anthology with the exception of Howard University Press. The very beginnings of Asian American writing is one of coalition. It is not often discussed how the history of Asian American activism and art is interwoven with African American cultural production. I credit my own intellectual liberation to writers from the Black radical tradition, and simultaneously, Hall's experience is not my own. The history of chattel slavery is distinctive from the immigrant history from which I come. This is to say, I continue to learn more about what he says here, but it is not my lived experience. I work to learn more about this history and how it becomes the present, so that it becomes a part of my writing and teaching. I do so cognizant of the violence of both erasure and appropriation, of the ways that anti-Blackness is perpetuated on behalf of contemporary Asian American organizing in life. So, the line, I was brought up to understand you, I read your literature, I knew daffodils off by heart before I knew the name of a Jamaican flower. Culture remains powerful because it holds complex portals to desires and memories. Culture provides linkages to the things others want us to see and remember. Daffodils, for those of you who know, is a poem by the British Romantic poet William Wordsworth. Understanding, memorizing the landscape of the colonizer before everything else can be witnessed in the form of a poem about a flower. The power of colonization is transmitted in education, in the learning of things that are beautiful and also painful. When Hall states, I was brought up to understand you, perhaps it's important to know that he was born in 1932 in what was called Colony of Jamaica, as Jamaica had been a British colony for over a century. I spend time looking up the growth of daffodils in Jamaica, and then take time to look for a native flower to Jamaica and learn that hibiscus is one of them. My association with hibiscus has always been bright, and now it belongs with Hall. You don't lose that, it becomes stronger. I've seen the term decolonization float around as of late. Decolonize this syllabus and this department, so forth, as if to do so would be swift and even simple. These calls might come from a place with good intentions, but good intentions are no longer enough. As Hall suggests, the stuff we learn about and from becomes stronger. How does one lose a beautiful poem? The culture that becomes a part of us stays with us. Thus, the project of racial injustice and racial literacy investigates the operations of culture to make new demands of power. Inclusion and visibility are not enough if the structural forces behind them remain the same. All serious efforts concerning racial injustice must tend to the material dynamics of power and violence. As we end, I hope we can discuss the ways that Northeastern might structurally support such efforts, because conversations about someone like Stewart Hall, hibiscus, and more will reflect the structural dynamics of this institution. Culture is an expression of power. What are the power dynamics of this place? Thank you. And now to you, Dr. Aljoe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kim. And this was a fantastic, nuanced articulation of the various ways in which culture affects racial literacy. And so I thought, so at this point, we'll turn to questions questions that the audience might have. Please feel free to post those questions in the chat. And while folks are thinking about what they might think about asking folks, I'm going to start us off on our discussion here. And since Dr. Kim had framed it so lovely, I think let's start there. So let's start with this question of what Northeastern can do. And so what is Northeastern's responsibility as an institution of higher learning in terms of these conversations around culture and racial literacy? Maybe we can start with Dr. Pearson. And Dr. Pearson, maybe you can talk a little bit about the assignment that your essay or your comments came from regarding cultural, when you have your students write cultural narratives.
Sorry. So I think the hardest thing to do on the journey toward understanding any concepts of racial literacy, like racial understanding, is to begin with the self, right? It's the hardest thing to do, but the core at any cross-racial understanding is, how do we become to know who we are, and the process of understanding who we are in relation to others. And so, beginning with the darkest, deepest understanding of, like, where do I come from? How do I know who I am? How do I engage, prepare to engage with others? and recognize my engagement with others. That's where the cultural narrative comes from. And so I ask students to really get into their storytelling, because it's through stories. It's always through stories that we learn something about one another. And yeah, so that's where I began. And I shared my story because I felt a little like I'm asking my students to be vulnerable. And so I allowed myself to be a little vulnerable as well.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up in the chat. So Melissa Farrick is asking whether your approach is similar to, whether you know about Dr. Lawrence Lightfoot's portraiture pedagogy, and whether you utilize this in your practice.
Yeah, no, I don't. Quite honestly, I use a lot of just really practical first approaches. I use a lot of like American cultural narratives, right? So Disney tells us a lot about cultural narratives. Disney is teaching us a lot about what it means to be a part of a culture, whether it's like Cinderella or the Horatio Algiers stories, or any other interpretations that Disney has used to teach people who they are. So no, I don't go really high culture. I just try to, where are you? What do your grandparents tell you about who you think you are? Those kinds of stories. So no, I don't go really deep into sorry.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Sutton or Dr. Kim, would you like to weigh in on this question of Northeastern's responsibility?
I was just going to add to say that it's something that came up in our broader conversation around institutional power. So I would put Northeastern as not an isolated case. All universities at this point, with the resources and the profile that Northeastern is manages, is to think about why, what we call the episodic crises, right? All of a sudden this conversation is happening now, right? It's what we call cyclical. There's moments of rupture when this happens over and over again. So I would say one of the things that we need to do is to recognize that this is not reactionary, or this is not a one-time, but we see this type of episodic crisis, number one. And number two, how can we individually impact change? We look at hiring. We looked at one of the conversations we all had amongst ourselves was the role of, in terms of larger museums and institutions, and why changing policy has to manifest in different hiring practices, and those things work in tandem. So just thinking about Northeastern not as an isolated case, right? And also not thinking about this current moment in 2020 as somehow being new, different, or isolated, but part of a larger episodic crises around race and institutional power.
Thank you. Dr. Kim?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is thinking about or looking to what student activists at Northeastern, but all over the United States, have asked for in terms of a re-examination with institutional relationships with policing. And I know that the next session will be about this, but I think specifically really learning about the history of policing, and then also like the horizon and movement towards prison and police abolition is really important, because that is what students are talking about. That's what activists have been talking about for decades now. And I think that that's something that we can, as institutions, that's something that we can all sort of return to. A discussion about power and race will always include a discussion about violence and the police.
Thank you all. So I'm going to turn again to the chat. There's a question for Dr. Kim about, you mentioned how good intentions are no longer enough. What can we as students and future professionals do to help dismantle these oppressive institutions, especially if we do not have much economic means?
Thank you. That's such a good question. And I think that it's such a great analysis of power in terms of the hierarchy. It is really set up oftentimes for it to appear as if students are at the bottom of the power hierarchy in the university. But I also think that there's perhaps more we could do with even this analysis. I think that maybe asking that question always is really important. Like, what are the intentions of the change moving forward? And the people who don't have power, like how are their voices, their thoughts, their ideas in politics? Where are they? How can we find them? If you feel like that you are coming from a community where you're constantly being marginalized. There's a Mari Matsuda quote that I asked for the panelists or the administrators to put up here, because she talks about this in relation with Asian American identity formation. So she asks this question of, like, you know, Asian American activism often returns to this notion of the sort of racial middle, that oftentimes we're relegated to this like middle position where things just were not as visible, but at the same time, economically, perhaps like we occupied a sort of boring position. And she says, like, actually this middle position is really important, because the middle position can be a way where you work against the power structures above you, and you work with those perhaps in the hierarchy below you. So I've often thought of that as like, what if whoever occupies the middle, be it students or faculty or people who work in art, what if it isn't just that we're working with forces of power, those above us, but we always look for those who have less power than us.
Any of the other panelists like to weigh in on that question?
I would just, sorry, I was just going to add to say, again, to follow up on Dr. Pearson and Dr. Kim's comments, to say, you know, what's important to me is the way that the acts of citation and which histories you're choosing to enumerate, and which those are choices we have in terms of the work of students, of what people are doing now. And I think that's really where, when I want to think about an ethos or an ethics of citation, in terms of what topics you're going to shine a light on, where you're going to have shared stakes in terms of your own work in the field. I think those are extraordinarily important decisions in thinking about the ways in which how do institutions get dismantled. We talked about this term monolithic, and change in institutions seems quite monolithic, or that these are intractable institutions. And what we've been talking about from Stewart Hall to Dr. Pearson's own work in particular is that it's the choices of individuals, right, and acts of citation and individual moments of citation and difference and pointing outwards. And I think that's one of the kind of key things that we were talking about too, about institutional power, comes down to individual choices, and it's important to think about those as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Can I say?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I can't say enough about how much the lived experience is so important to research, which is why I emphasize the personal narrative. That not only is culture constructed through big narratives like citation narratives, but it's also reconstructed and redesigned every day by our lived experiences. So I tell students, like, you don't necessarily, because they often say, oh, that's not my realism, you know, like I don't live the same experiences, say Zora Neale Hurston, as we talked about, Dr. Aljoe, like we recognize Zora Neale Hurston as a story, but not the story, but we actually redesign and conform and, you know, reconform that story to be another story. And so, you know, you can't discredit somebody's everyday in and out experiences that could help reshape those realizations. So yeah, that's my only point about that, is like, we're not fixed. Culture isn't fixed.
Yes. And this speaks to, I think, part of the reason why I was so excited about, you know, working with you guys on this panel, is because of this idea and which Dr. Kim has spoken to, as well as Dr. Sutton and Dr. Pearson, with this idea of coalitional politics, right? This idea of thinking about power in a much more diffuse kind of way. And when you think about it in a much more diffuse kind of way, right, the opportunities for those little spaces in which, right, people who are traditionally disenfranchised, people who are subalterns, for example, can flip the script to quote Melissa, but also, right, challenge the narratives that they have been assigned, right? As Dr. Kim and Dr. Sutton pointed out, right, that position in the middle, right, is also a place of potential power. So we've gotten some really great questions here, and we don't have a lot of time yet left. So I think I'm going to focus on two questions in particular. One is from a colleague of ours in the English department, which is about how do we equip students to have conversations about race in situations in which there, right, it isn't, right, really a conversation about race. And so I was wondering if anyone on the panel wants to speak to that, right? So this question is about sending students out to other courses. How can we equip them for, say, science, engineering, business, where maybe race isn't on the table, probably in the same kinds of ways, right? But maybe it really should be. Can we help equip students through training and culture classes to ask questions in these other realms?
Yeah, can I jump in
Sure.
on that one?
Yep.
Yeah, the whole purpose and premise of doing the cultural narratives to get students to understand and situate themselves in whatever context they're going to be in, right? So you find yourself in a science context, in a social science context, in the art context. Where do you begin, right? So the first thing I have students to understand is, like, before we honestly can engage and take on anything, we have to situate ourselves in whatever positions we are in. What made us become who we are, attracted to what we are attracted to, in order to embrace wherever we're going. And so, yeah, I think that's the first and primary thing. And most of us, you know, I'm old, a lot of us are older, you know, like if we had to go back into our first selves and to say what brought us to where we are. You know, there's a lot of work to be done. You know, there's a lot of influence, there's a lot of unpacking who we are. And yeah, that's what the narrative, the cultural narrative, the identity narrative actually does.
I wanted to quickly add, again, taking Dr. Kim's lesson of Stewart Hall, is to remind ourselves around 1970, he's writing encoding, decoding as a way to think about communication. And I think this is very applicable to social science as well, and and engineering and other fields. So that one of the key things is to think about how meaning is, like, this is a two-way channel, that things are encoded and we also decode differently. And I think that Stewart Hall lesson could be something that it's not disciplinary specific, but really talks about how all of these fields rely. And we're seeing that being done in language around computing and computer science. We're seeing that language around the way that language is coded and decoded differently. I think is something that is, again, something that Stewart Hall put on the map in 1970 that is deeply applicable now.
Thank you. Dr. Kim?
And I was just going to add very quickly, I think that, of course, I teach poetry and novels and artwork, but this comes from a place, like there's a context in which it's made. And I think, like, pointing to the context, not just the place, but like the economy at the moment, the newspapers at the moment, really helps situate where the object lives. And so then moving to like a discussion about business, or the kinds of ways in which we can read like business history at that moment, I think will allow students to think about how to ask those questions in an actual, in a business class, right? Rather than like a class that's like thinking about literature, but also with the backdrop of business in mind.
Yeah, I think looking at the syllabus, right? Who's on the syllabus? What are they writing? Where what they are writing is appearing, right? The locations in which their publications are appearing, I think, are important ways that students can engage with this kind of question, and suggesting that maybe more diverse readings, or readings from different perspectives might be useful. So as we wrap up here, I want to just turn to a concluding question that offers a segue into our next panel on community policing, to get back to kind of one of the first questions that Dr. Kim posed for us. So there are a number of national and community organizations, right, that are calling for an end to ICE and current structures of policing. And so I thought maybe as a final comment, our panelists could weigh in on this question about the cultural narratives that might be at work in these conversations, or the role that culture might play in the conversations about ICE and ending of the police. Dr. Kim?
Can I actually begin? Because this is something that I've been thinking about a little compulsively. I've been thinking a lot about how many procedural crime dramas I watch. Like, I love detective drama. So, I think I've rewatched like the trashy TV show Castle many times, more times than I would like to admit. And over the summer, I had this thought that the structure of pretty much the crime dramas that I've consumed, it's set up so that the detective is incredibly complex, and sometimes the criminal is also complex, but moreover, the detective character. And the episode, it ends with some kind of incarceration, or the season ends with an incarceration. So justice and incarceration are situated to be almost exactly the same thing. So, and then with the exceptions of a few kind of cultural narratives, incarceration really marks the end of the story of the character that's considered the criminal. And I wondered a lot about how, when I have conversations with people where it seems like incarceration is the only or policing is the only viable option, if it does stem from the fact that culturally justice and incarceration are almost seen as exactly the same thing. And it's also because, like, literally the episode will not end. Like, there's a kind of anxiety that's developed. Like, we're waiting for the end. We're waiting for the sort of win. And what it would be like to create stories where, like, we live with that anxiety, we live with that uncertainty. We're not really sure I think that there's been enough research that shows like incarceration doesn't lead to the form of justice that we think that it does. So what would be required for other kinds of stories to be imagined, ones that actually think of justice and prioritize that?
And I'll just add one closing, the work of Christina Sharp's In the Wake. And so thinking about the carceral state, not just as one, again, event or one moment, but the kind of aftermath historically and socially that happens. So one of the things about culture is to think about that we tell these stories about the carceral state, or we think of it as a certain kind of time of in the case of ICE, around borders or nationality or issues of legality, but these are slippages, right? And then they have residual effects that happen over time. So again, just thinking about something about this concept of both the event and the carceral state, but also in the wake of that system that we find ourselves, that culture also perpetuates and operates within.
Dr. Pearson?
Yeah, so I always like to end with the counter narrative, right? So there's a narrative that you know is going to happen, like the villain is the villain and the hero is the hero. But what's the counter narrative? Like what happens when the anti-hero gets away? I'm delighted all the time with the I don't watch it a lot, but the movie Get Out, Jordan Peele's Get Out, and at the end of the story where there's a counter narrative where he either gets away because his friend comes and rescues him, or there's a counter narrative where he's captured and there's no way that he can talk his way out of killing all these white people. I think it's in the counter narrative that we can imagine another ending where the actual oppressed get to finish the story rather than the oppressor, kind of continue the expected story. And so that's why I love storytelling so much. I love the counter narratives, the narratives that I don't expect, that get to tell me a new ending, a new beginning, something else. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was great. And unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. Many thanks to our panelists and our audience for your participation. The recording of this event will be available on Northeastern's racial literacy website. Please see the chat for the link. Please be sure to join Dr. Rod Brunson, who will be moderating for the last event in this series, Racial Literacy, Community, and Policing. This will take place next Tuesday, October 20th from 5 to 6 p.m. We hope you can join us. Thank you and have a great evening. Bye, everyone.